I've known Carlos Rodríguez-Pastor for over 10 years, and I'm so happy that he and his wife Gabi are here with us tonight. I'm also really pleased that he's accepting this award, because the work he's doing is showing how much business can do bridging divides. We've always said, as we've worked on different issues around the world, you can find allies in every sector, and Carlos is certainly an ally in the business sector. Apart from his businesses, he is the founder of Innova Schools, which provides quality education at reasonable costs to families in Peru. And it's achieving this in ways that are truly innovative. The schools were created through a design process that really engaged educators and parents. They're part of a for-profit company and are demonstrating the positive social impact businesses can have. And perhaps most importantly, the curriculum focuses not just on traditional academics, but also on the softer social skills that kids, like all of us, need today for, among other things, building trust within themselves and with each other. Innova is educating the whole person as leaders, as collaborators, and even as trust builders. That certainly bodes well for the future of Peru and for all of us if we can learn from what he's doing. So let's take a look at this brief video.
We realized that this country has been growing for the last 25 years. But then we also realized that we've been dead last in the PISA rankings, or close to last, for the same period.
So Carlos, it's my great pleasure to present you with this award, and then we're going to have a short conversation about what he's doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We're going to sit over here. So just to give the audience a sense of how this came about, can you tell us how you started and what process you used and why you founded Innova Schools?
Sure. I was one of those guys who would go to these conferences where somebody would get up and talk about education and how important it is and how we need to change it and so on and so on. And you all get up and clap and get excited. Then you go back to your routine. Then a year later, you go to another conference, the same thing happens. And I'm lucky to have a wife who's always tugging at me behind the scenes. And one day she says, hey, you got to do something about this, or we have to do something about this. So we started volunteering on weekends. This is before we had kids. And actually helping kids from gangs in a program we made up called I Have a Dream, after Martin Luther King. And we were actually doing all the chats ourselves. We would show them things like Life is Beautiful, the movie. These kids couldn't read or write. And what started as kind of an initial pep talk turned out to be every Saturday. And eventually, what we found out is how bad the education system was in Peru. And so we started looking around and knocking on these schools, and what was fascinating is that already in Peru, 50% of the people sent their kids in Lima to private schools. But they were just as bad as the public schools, and about 27% countrywide. And in one of these schools that we visited, we were not very good, I would pretend I was a father who had kids who wanted to bring them into the school and insisting on questions, and the person I was asking was actually the principal, the director, and also the owner of the school. So she was ready to kick me out, thinking I was the IRS and going after her. And I said, before you get rid of me, just one last question. Why did you decide to build a school? And her answer has stuck with me till now. She said, because it's more profitable than a Chinese food restaurant. So that was a level of commitment that there was for schools. So we figured, if we put all these guys out of business, there'll be more Chinese food restaurants, and everybody will be fine. So we looked to see if we could buy a chain of schools. Usually that's what you do in business. You buy something and you fix it. But there was nothing. There were one school here, one school there. And we found this guy named Jorge Suski, who is my hero. He's our CEO, who had left as a CEO of a very important company in Peru to pursue his dream, to build 10 schools and then retire. It took us a year to convince Jorge to come and work for us. He had one school and he was building 2 more. And after we sealed the deal, I had a very difficult conversation with Jorge. And I said, Jorge, I want to talk to you about something. I don't want to do your schools. Actually, I don't think your schools are very good. I want to do something different. And you can imagine his reaction. No, this is like a bait and switch. I made the wrong move or whatever. But I know somebody who can help us. So we went and called a company on the West Coast called IDEO, which is an innovation consulting company, very famous. It did a lot of work for Steve Jobs, etc. And we went to IDEO and told them, we'd like to build a school system that had 4 characteristics. Number 1, that it was affordable for the emerging middle class, which is between $100 and $160 a month. 2, we wanted a project that was scalable. This wasn't a feel-good one school and then tell all your friends at the country club what you're doing. This is something to maybe change the country or perhaps cross borders. 3, it had to have academic excellence. Because if you don't move the needle, you're going to be just like the other schools that are on the verge of becoming Chinese food restaurants. And the last was it had to be profitable. And that turns off a lot of educators because this whole dilemma between for-profit and not-for-profit. But it's very simple. If it's not profitable, it can't be sustainable. As a result, you can't build more schools. So we spent about a year working on this, interviewing teachers, students, parents, and as you mentioned in building trust, we were just listening and listening and listening. We had no biases because we were not educators. We came from the private sector, and what we found in all these trips that we made is that nobody had really gotten it right. There were some good things over here, some good things at this school, but nobody had really attempted to do schools at scale in countries such as Peru. And one thing led to the other, and today, as you saw in the video, we have 37,000 kids, 49 schools, growing about 15,000 kids a year. And 3 years from now, we'll be 1% of the K through 12 population in Peru. It's still small, but I think there's hope for that 1%.
And I'm just wondering, because obviously the other 99% are divided between some of the other private schools and public schools. Can you imagine creating a link with government? And if so, how would that look?
Well, I think that to change a country, it's got to be the public sector. We have to live for another 200 years to be able to make inroads with all the work that needs to be done. But I think part of our mission is to really push as much as we can, and in a way show up the government and have people and parents start to say, wait a minute, how come the public sector is not so good when you have these affordable schools that are doing much better? So number 1, we share everything we can. So David Kelly, Sal Khan, every person that we bring to Peru, we always also bring to either meet the president or Minister of Education and to see what we can do. But what's really frustrating and really challenging in our countries is, just think about this. The last 18 months, we've had 4 ministers of education. Imagine in your organizations, if you had a boss every 4.5 months. Can you imagine the new boss coming in and saying, we're going to do this, that, and everybody kind of rolling their eyes out, just hang out for 4 months, there'll be a new guy coming in? That's what makes it difficult. And that's the reason we admire countries like Singapore, that make education kind of a national priority. It's not caught up in politics or who's right, who's wrong. It's caught up on how can we push the country forward. And especially in today's world that's changing so fast, I think if you don't have an educated population, you're going to be in trouble fairly soon.
And can you tell a little bit about the softer skills, which I just heard tonight from one of our participants here from Mexico, that Singapore was maybe the first country to put social and emotional learning in, and I'm happy to say that through Catalina Barragan, Mexico is the second. But how does that social and emotional learning, the softer skills, fit into your curriculum?
So we teach in a different way than maybe traditional schools because we kind of have to. We have a blended learning model where 70% is classroom and 30% is solo learning, with a lot of lab time with computers. We use Khan Academy quite a bit, and other programs that are available. But our classrooms are slightly different than the traditional monologue, where the teacher comes in, knows it all, and it's kind of like a drill and kill, and kids have to memorize, take the exam, and then move on. Our classes, for instance, let's say we're studying the solar system. So 25 kids to a classroom. A teacher comes in, takes the class of the day from something we developed, which is our secret sauce, called the Teacher Resource Center, which has every single class, every single grade, K through 12, so that we can standardize our teaching. They don't read scripts. They're given what's the minimum they should teach, and they add to that, and it's constantly being replenished. So they start off by watching an engaging video. It could be a Nat Geo video on the solar system. Then they break out in 5 groups of 5. We give them 2 computers per table, so that they have to share. Not everybody kind of works alone. And each table, each little group, has 3 or 4 questions to resolve. So it's inquiry-based. They go on the web. The instructor meanders around the room, and these kids are working on teams or collaborating. And towards the end of the class, there's one volunteer from each of the groups that has to kind of tell the class what they learned, and so on and so forth. So you're teaching public speaking, collaboration, the self-esteem goes up, these kids look at each other eye to eye, and the retention and the learning is quite remarkable, as opposed to the teaching that I had when I went to school.
Yeah. And I know you're taking this to other countries. How's that going? Where are you taking it?
Well, it's funny enough that I think a few years ago, I was in one of the Synergos workshops, and somebody in the audience was there, and then I think I caught up with them later on, and then the third time in another event, and they kept coming up to us, and I think they're here tonight. It's a Del Valle family from Mexico, a very successful business group who decided to take a plunge and see if we can bring Innova and the success of Innova in Mexico. So we're opening our first 2 schools in September. We'll have... Maybe you can stand up, Francisco, and take a bow. There's Francisco, another hero we spotted. And let me tell you, what's unusual about what happened is that most of the time, when we make these presentations and everybody says, wow, this is really cool, and they come up, they'll give their cards, and that's it. With Francisco, he called me and he said, Carlos, I'd like to come visit the schools. And it was around December. I said, Francisco, we're going to close in about 10 days. So why don't you come back in March when they start again? Okay, I'll be there next Monday. And there he was with his wife next Monday. And now we're about to open our schools.
That is a very cool story. It fits in what we call chains of trust.
That's right.
You know, one thing leads to another, leads to another. I'm really curious to hear more about your new healthcare initiative. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So one of the things that our group does is we feel that we should take on the toughest challenges in the country. So education is one, it's a really hard one, and healthcare is another. We're lucky in Peru that we still have a young population. So 60% of the population of Peru is 31 years or younger. So that's why you don't hear a lot about healthcare. But 15, 20 years from now, that's going to change. So I think it's time to start. So what happens in the traditional healthcare in Peru is most people are not insured, and if they are, it's by the state, and unfortunately, the service is not very good. So a typical person who's ill has to get up very early in the morning, make a very, very long line, 5, 6, 7 hours, and by the time they get to the front of the line, they get the golden ticket. And the golden ticket says, come back in 30 days. Oh. If they're still alive, they come back. But what they do most of the time is they go to the pharmacy. And the pharmacist is kind of your trusted provider. We bought a pharmacy chain about 5, 6 years ago, and another one recently. So our group has about 2,200 pharmacies in 250 cities, and we are the first stop in healthcare right now in Peru. So we decided, why not try to see if we could replicate the Innova model for healthcare? And again, we partner with IDO. We've been spending now, 18 months on this project. And we're building out our first clinic. It should open in October of this year. And along with that, we're working on digital medical records. So we already have a lot of transactions and relationships with some of the consumers that come to our pharmacies. And I think the next would be health insurance. So we can wait and get frustrated and curse at the government, who's in power, or we can get involved and really push it, and then you'll see how fast governments can start to react and start to catch up. Because at the end, we really believe that if we make the pie bigger, Peru will be better off.
Sounds like you and Ernie should talk, actually. But I wanted to follow up on the role of the private sector and how you see your own role as probably the largest group of companies in Peru. And maybe you could comment on that, what you see as your responsibility as a result of that. And also maybe that interesting thing you were telling me about building bridges, except this time literal ones.
Well, the purpose of our group is to help Peru become a developed country. It takes 40 to 50 years, growing at between 5 to 7% per year, to become a developed country. Singapore did it in 40 years at 7%. Korea did it in close to 50 years at 5%. And what those two countries have in common is they were poorer than Peru 50 years ago. What did they do? They invested in human capital development. So what we try to do is make sure that all our businesses practice what's called creating shared value, where it has to be good not only for the shareholders, it has to be good for the customers, for the consumers, but also for all of society. And only when that happens do we get excited and get involved in an enterprise. And our short-term goal is to make Peru be the best place to raise a family in Latin America. Hopefully we can make that happen in 5 or 7 years. And that means opportunity for all, that means security, that means good education, that means healthcare, that means a lot of things. So we have a lot of work to do. And the approach we have is, if we are good citizens and we do things the correct way, hopefully we'll have a lot of other companies that will want to copy, and then it kind of feeds on itself. Now, one of the most frustrating things that we see in emerging economies, and it's present in Peru and in a lot of Latin American countries, is corruption. And people have a way of justifying and not paying their taxes and saying, well, look at these politicians and look at these roads that fall apart. Why should we be formal? And Peru has a 60% informal rate. 60% of the economy is informal. It's really hard to become a developed country if there's no trust in the system. So a few years ago, the government was thinking about implementing a plan where the taxes that you pay as a company can be used to execute public works, so long as the government approves it beforehand. So there was this bridge we looked at in the second largest city of Peru, Arequipa. It had been on the drawing board for over 50 years. So I think something like 14 different mayors weren't able to get this bridge constructed. And we called the largest beer company and the largest mining company in the region and asked them, would you like to partner with us? And it's going to be a $100 million project, but we're going to use the taxes we would otherwise pay to the government, but we have the responsibility to complete this on time and on budget. And every 2 months, the government has to give us an okay, and they reimburse us. So we actually make the outlay, and we get reimbursed if we stay on track. Well, the bridge was done on time and on budget. I remember the day we opened it. 55,000 citizens of this city in Arequipa that have been waiting for their bridge over 50 years crossed it by foot. Wow. It saves them 40 minutes per day. Now, that's the good guy, the good side. Now, the business side is they have 40 minutes to shop in our stores or do other things. So that's what shared value is kind of all about. And last year we had something that affects us every so many years, which is the El Nino effect. You hear about it in the States, but it goes smack straight to Peru. So every 7 to 8 years, our weather kind of goes crazy. And a lot of flooding in the north of the country and some droughts in the south. And most of the bridges were destroyed in the north. So we partnered with a few other companies, and we're building over 60 bridges in the next 2 years to make sure the Peruvians are better connected. And it's also kind of a symbol of connecting private sector with the public sector and with the community as a whole.
That's a great way to end. But I don't want to end without saying that it's clear from your description in the beginning that we should also be celebrating Gabi and how this came about. So let's also give Gabi a hand.